In this section, we're going to add the behavior to our spawn points that will spawn our enemies in the game at a certain interval. I could go through each spawn point and add our spawning script to it. However, since they're all going to get this script as a component, I'm simply going to highlight all of the spawn points. You'll notice that I didn't highlight the spawn point's parent object because that's not actually going to spawn any enemies. Instead, I'm just highlighting the 5 spawn points that are actually corresponding to one of the different enemy types. With them all selected, I'm going to click Add Component, Scripts, and Enemy Spawner. Now I'm going to deselect all of the spawn points because I need to configure each of them individually. I'm going to start with the Zombunny spawn point. The Enemy Spawner script has a few properties we need to take note of. First is the enemy prefab, representing the enemy that it will spawn. Next is the spawn rate. This is how many seconds it takes to spawn an enemy. A default value of 5 means one enemy will spawn every 5 seconds. The next property is max enemies, meaning how many enemies at a time can this spawner have in the game. This is important because if we didn't have a cap to the number of enemies we could spawn, a player could run around our game and not actually defeat any enemies. Over time, the game would continue to fill with more and more enemies until eventually it slowed down and potentially crashed. Limiting the number of enemies we have in the game at a time prevents any performance issues that would occur due to too many enemies existing on lower powered platforms. Finally, we have a debugging property, Can Spawn. We can turn this off if we want to test some game mechanics without the enemies spawning and chasing our player around. As it stands, we're going to leave this on. For the Zombunny spawner, we need to first start by applying the Zombunny prefab to the enemy prefab property. I'm going to go to the prefabs folder and then the characters subfolder. I'm going to click and drag the Zombunny onto the enemy prefab property. Next, I'm going to leave the spawn rate of 5 seconds, but I'm going to change the max enemies to be 4. As you play around with the Zombie Toys project, you might notice that your computer is powerful enough that you can increase the max enemies, or if you're experiencing performance issues, you can even lower max enemies down to 2 or even 1. The next spawn point we're going to look at is the Clown spawn point. The enemy prefab for this is going to be the Clown prefab. I'm going to set the spawn rate to 15 seconds with a max number of clowns set at 2. Next comes the Zombear spawn point, and we're going to set the Zombear as the enemy prefab with a spawn rate of 6 seconds and a max enemies of 3. Following right along, we come to the Hellephant spawn point, which is going to spawn the Hellephant after 10 seconds, and there can be 2 of them. Last but not least, we have the Zombie Duck spawn point. This also will be set to every 10 seconds, with the max number of zombie ducks set at 2. We've now set up all of our enemy spawn points. We need to save our changes back to the spawn points prefab. So I'm going to click on the spawn points parent game object and select Apply. Now let's press play and test it out. We should notice after a few seconds a Zombunny spawning. As we walk around, we can notice more and more of the enemy types. All enemies look like they're correctly spawning. We can see now that it's easy to get overrun with the sheer number of enemies that are spawning. It's a good thing that soon the player is going to have some attacks of their own, otherwise this would not be a very fun game.